The apartment smelled like defeat and instant coffee. Evelyn Harper Eve, to anyone who'd bothered to know her, sat on the floor of her studio surrounded by cardboard boxes she couldn't afford to fill with anything worth keeping. 29 years old, and this was what her life had amounted to. 3 garbage bags of clothes, a futon that sagged in the middle like her hopes, and her grandmother's dresser. That dresser, God, that dresser. It stood against the far wall like an accusation, all dark wood and tarnished brass handles taking up space she didn't have in a life already too small. If you're enjoying this story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. Her ex-husband Derek had laughed at it during their brief marriage. Her mother had begged her to leave it behind when she moved out at 19. Her sister Vivian, sleek and successful in her downtown condo, had offered to pay for a dumpster just to get rid of it. "Eve, it's hideous," Vivian had said last week, wrinkling her nose at the ornate carved flowers on the drawers. "And it smells like mothballs. Why are you dragging that thing from apartment to apartment? It's not even antique, it's just old." "Because Grandma Maggie gave it to me," Eve had wanted to say, "because it's the only thing I have left of her, because when everyone else gave up on me, she didn't." But she'd said nothing. Just smiled that tired smile that had become her default expression and changed the subject. Now sitting in the wreckage of her third eviction in 2 years, Eve stared at the dresser and wondered if Vivian was right. Maybe she should just let it go. God knew she needed to let go of a lot of things. Her phone buzzed. Another text from her landlord. "Final notice. 3 days to vacate or I put your belongings on the street." Eve's hands shook as she set the phone down. She'd been here before too many times. The cycle was always the same work. 2 jobs fall behind on bills anyway. Get evicted, start over somewhere cheaper and worse. The jobs themselves were honest work, morning shift at the bakery on 5th Street, kneading dough while the city still slept, afternoon and evening, at Pearl's Diner serving coffee to people who looked through her like she was invisible. Between both jobs, she cleared maybe $2,300 a month. Rent alone was $1,550. Add utilities, food, the bus pass she needed to get to work, and the math never worked. It just never worked. A knock at the door made her jump. She knew that knock. Heavy, impatient. Tyler Knox, the landlord's son, who enjoyed delivering bad news a little too much. "Eve, I know you're in there." She opened the door a crack. Tyler stood in the hallway, arms crossed, smirking. He was 23, still living with his parents, and somehow looked down on her like she was the failure. 3 days, he said. "Dad's serious this time. You're out Friday one way or another." "I'm working on it." Her voice sounded small even to her own ears. "You're always working on it." His eyes drifted past her to the dresser. "You know, if you sold that ugly thing, you might actually make rent. There's a vintage store on Maple that takes junk furniture." Something hot flashed through Eve's chest. "It's not junk." "Could have fooled me," Tyler shrugged. "Anyway, Friday, don't make this harder than it needs to be." He left. Eve closed the door and leaned against it, eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. She'd cried enough. Crying changed nothing. She walked to the dresser and ran her hand across the top, feeling the worn wood beneath her palm. The surface was scratched from decades of use, the finish faded and uneven. But the craftsmanship was solid. You could tell someone had built this with care, with attention to detail most modern furniture lacked. Grandma Maggie had given it to her on her 16th birthday. Eve remembered that day clearly. They'd been sitting in Maggie's tiny house, the one she'd lived in for 40 years after Grandpa William died. Maggie had taken Eve's hands in hers, those hands that were always soft despite years of hard work, and said something Eve never forgot. "This dresser has been in our family since I was your age. It's not fancy and it's not worth much money, but it held my dreams when I was young and scared. It held your mother's things when she was a girl, though she never appreciated it. And now I'm giving it to you, Eve, because I think you understand something most people don't." "What's that, Grandma Yoaks?" "That the most valuable things aren't always the ones that shine." Eve had treasured the dresser ever since. Through high school, through the disaster of her marriage to Derek, through every move and setback and disappointment, the dresser had been her constant, the one thing that was truly hers. But now standing in this cramped studio with eviction looming, Eve wondered if holding on to it was just stubbornness. Maybe it was time to be practical. Time to let go. Her shift at the bakery started in 6 hours. She should sleep. Instead, she opened the top drawer of the dresser, looking at the meager contents, a few old t-shirts, some photographs, a jewelry box containing costume pieces that had belonged to Maggie. Nothing valuable, but pretty enough. She moved to the second drawer, more clothes. The third drawer stuck as it always did. Eve had to jiggle it, pulling at an angle to get it to slide. She'd been meaning to fix it for years, but never got around to it. The fourth drawer was empty except for some tissue paper Maggie had lined it with decades ago. Eve ran her fingers along the bottom, feeling the slight warp in the wood. She'd always assumed it was just age, just the dresser settling over time. But tonight, tired and desperate and done with holding things together, Eve pressed down harder on the warp section. Something clicked. Eve froze. That wasn't the sound of old wood creaking. That was mechanical, deliberate. She pressed again. Another click. And then impossibly the bottom of the drawer shifted. Not broke, shifted like it was designed to move. Her hard hammering, Eve pulled the drawer completely out and set it on the floor. She knelt down and looked into the empty cavity, her phone's flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. The narrow beam revealed what she'd missed for 13 years. The bottom of the fourth drawer was actually a false bottom, sitting about 3 inches above the real base. And along one edge, barely visible, was a tiny brass catch. Eve's fingers trembled as she pressed it. The false bottom sprang up, slightly revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a leather portfolio, the kind lawyers used to carry important documents. It was pristine, carefully preserved, wrapped in what looked like acid-free tissue paper. Not the kind of thing her grandmother could have afforded. Not the kind of thing that should be hidden in a dresser everyone called worthless. Eve lifted it out with shaking hands. The leather was soft, expensive, not the kind to crack or fade, even after decades. She carried the portfolio to her futon and sat down, her breath coming in short gasps. For a long moment, she just held it, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might mean, afraid of what it might not mean. Finally, she unzipped it. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Stock certificates, printed on thick paper with ornate borders. Eve didn't know much about investing, but even she recognized some of the company names. Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. The certificates were dated 1997, 1998, 2001. Ancient by tech standards. And the numbers? God, the numbers. 1,000 shares of Apple purchased in 1997 at $18 per share. 500 shares of Amazon purchased in 1998 at $85 per share. 750 shares of Microsoft purchased in 2001 at $27 per share. Eve's hands shook so badly, she almost dropped the portfolio. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be real. Because if it was real, if these stocks were legitimate and properly transferred and actually owned by her grandmother, her phone was in her hand before she consciously decided to pick it up. She typed frantically, Apple stock price, $178.72 per share. 1,000 shares. That was Eve's mind could barely process the math. $178,720. Amazon, current price $127.74 per share. 500 shares, $63,870. Microsoft, $378.91. 750 shares, $284,182. Eve's vision blurred. That was just 3 of the certificates. There were more. So many more. Google. Tesla. Her grandmother had bought Google at the IPO in 2004. She'd bought Tesla when everyone thought electric cars were a joke. And beneath the stock certificates, Eve found something else. Bearer bonds. She didn't know much about them, but she knew what bearer bond meant. Whoever held them owned them. No names, no registration, just possession. Each bond was for $100,000, and there were 30 of them. $3 million in bonds just sitting in the dresser, sitting there while she worked herself to exhaustion, sitting there while she got evicted, sitting there while she wore shoes with holes in the soles. Eve's breath came in gasps. This wasn't happening. This was a dream or a mistake or some kind of cruel joke. But the documents felt real. The weight of them was real. And at the bottom of the portfolio, tucked into a small envelope, was a letter in her grandmother's handwriting. Eve read the letter 3 times. Then she carefully folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and set the entire portfolio aside. Then she lay down on her futon and stared at the ceiling. $4.2 million. She'd been sleeping on furniture with $4.2 million hidden inside while working 2 jobs that barely paid her bills. Her grandmother had been a secret millionaire living in that tiny house, shopping at thrift stores, clipping coupons, and no one had known. No one except Eve sat up suddenly. The letter. Grandma Maggie had mentioned a lawyer in the letter, Lawrence Ashford. He was supposed to have information about a will about a house at 127 Oak Street, and something else. Something about a trust. $128 million in a trust. Eve read the letter again, her hands steadier now. Her mind starting to catch up with the shock. Eve, my darling, if you're reading this, I've passed and you've found what I've been hiding all these years. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I tried so many times, but fear kept the words locked inside. This dresser isn't just furniture. I modified it in 1987 after your grandfather died. I built the hidden compartment myself because I needed somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look. The stock certificates and bearer bonds in this portfolio are worth approximately $4.2 million. They're yours. But that's only the test portion. The real inheritance is the house at 127 Oak Street. I've left it to you in my will, but there's a condition: you must live there for at least 6 months before you can sell or transfer it. Why? Because hidden in that house is the rest of what I've built over 60 years, a trust containing $128 million. But you have to find it yourself. I've left clues in the house. If you're patient enough, smart enough, you'll discover what I've hidden. The lawyer holding my will is Lawrence Ashford. His contact information is in a separate envelope in this portfolio. But Eve, and this is important, don't trust Lawrence completely. He's the son of the man who once defrauded me and your grandfather. I hired him to keep my enemies close, but he doesn't know everything. He knows about the house. He doesn't know about what's inside it. Be careful, be smart, and never give up. I love you always. Grandma Maggie, P.S. This dresser has 2 more hidden compartments. Find them when you're ready. Eve's mind raced. $128 million. Hidden in a house her grandmother left her, a house she had to live in for 6 months. She looked around her studio apartment, the peeling paint, the water stain on the ceiling, the eviction notice that might as well be tattooed on her forehead at this point. She had 3 days to get out, and apparently she had a house waiting for her. But first she needed to understand what she actually had. Eve opened her laptop, a cheap model from 2015 that took 3 minutes to boot up, and started researching. How to verify stock certificates, what bearer bonds were, tax implications of sudden wealth. The more she read, the more her stomach churned. This was real. The certificates looked authentic with proper serial numbers and security features. The bearer bonds were legal, issued before 1982 when they were phased out. But converting them to cash, that would trigger immediate IRS attention. A woman who'd been living on $2,300 a month suddenly depositing millions. They'd audit her into the ground. She needed help. Professional help. A lawyer, an accountant, someone who understood estate law and taxes and how to handle sudden massive wealth without ending up in federal prison. Lawrence Ashford. The name sat heavy in her mind. The son of a con man, the lawyer her grandmother had hired but didn't fully trust. Eve found the second envelope in the portfolio. Inside was a business card: Lawrence Ashford and Associates, Estate Planning and Trust Management. She glanced at the clock. 3:17 in the morning. Her shift at the bakery started at 5:30. She should try to sleep. Instead, she lay there thinking about stock certificates and bearer bonds and a grandmother who'd lived small while sitting on a fortune. Why? Why had Maggie done it this way? Why hide everything? Why live in that tiny house, drive that ancient car, wear clothes from Goodwill when she had millions? The letter had mentioned fear. Fear of people changing. Fear of relationships built on money instead of love. Fear of her family tearing itself apart over wealth. And Eve understood suddenly why Grandma Maggie had chosen her. Not Vivian, who would have seen the money as proof she was always meant for better things. Not Eve's mother, who would have spent it trying to impress neighbors who didn't matter. But Eve, who'd kept that worthless dresser through evictions and mockery and everyone telling her to let it go. Someone knocked at the door. Eve's heart jumped. At 3 in the morning, she crept to the door, looked through the peephole. Derek, her ex-husband, drunk, swaying slightly in the hallway. She didn't open it. Eve, I know you're in there. His voice was slurred, aggressive. Open up! We need to talk about Clara, their daughter. Except Clara wasn't really Derek's daughter in any meaningful sense. He'd signed away his parental rights 6 years ago, walked out when Clara was 9 months old, and hadn't bothered to contact them since. Go away, Derek. I'm calling the police. Don't, he pounded on the door. I heard about your grandma. I heard she left you something. Money, right? Clara's my kid, too. I got rights. Eve's blood ran cold. How did he know? She'd only found the portfolio an hour ago. Unless Vivian must have told someone about Grandma Maggie's estate, and word had gotten around. In their family, gossip traveled faster than truth. You gave up your rights, Eve said through the door, her voice steadier than she felt. You have no claim to anything. We'll see what a lawyer says. That kid's mine biologically. I can get partial custody, and then you'll have to pay me support. He kicked the door. Open up. A neighbor's door opened down the hall. Someone, thank God, was calling the police. Derek must have heard it too because he stumbled away, shouting threats over his shoulder about lawyers in custody and what he was owed. Eve locked the deadbolt, shoved a chair under the doorknob, and stood there shaking. Derek had never been violent, just pathetic, but drunk and desperate for money. She didn't know what he might do. She grabbed her phone and the portfolio, stuffed them both into Clara's school backpack, the only bag she owned that had a decent lock, and moved to the window. If Derek came back with his brother Frank, she needed an exit plan. Frank DeLuca was Derek's older brother, and everything Derek wasn't smart calculating actually dangerous. He had a record fraud, assault, extortion. If Derek told Frank about a potential inheritance, Frank would see an opportunity. Eve looked at Clara asleep on the futon's far end, one arm draped over her worn stuffed rabbit. 7 years old, about to start second grade, and already she'd lived in 4 different apartments. Already she'd learned not to get too attached to homes or neighborhoods or friends who'd be left behind at the next eviction. Not this time, Eve whispered. This time we're getting out. When her alarm went off at 4:45, Eve hadn't slept at all. She got up, made instant coffee, woke Clara gently. Mommy has to go to work, sweetheart. Mrs. Chen downstairs will watch you until daycare opens, okay? Clara rubbed her eyes. Are we moving again? Maybe, but this time might be different. This time might be good. At the bakery, Judith Wheeler took one look at Eve's face and frowned. You look terrible. Something happened. Just didn't sleep well. You never sleep well. Judith was 52, had run the bakery for 20 years, and had a no-nonsense kindness that Eve appreciated. But this is different. You look scared. Eve kneaded dough, the familiar rhythm usually soothing, but not today. Her mind kept spinning. 4.2 million in her backpack, hidden in the employee locker. 128 million supposedly hidden in a house. Derek knowing something, Frank potentially getting involved. A lawyer named Lawrence Ashford, who might or might not be trustworthy. I need to ask you something, Eve said finally. If you had to verify that old stock certificates were real, how would you do it? Judith's hands stilled on the bread she was shaping. That's a specific question. Just curious. Eve, Judith's voice was gentle but firm. What's going on? And suddenly, standing in the warm bakery at 6 in the morning with a flour dust floating in the early light, Eve almost told her everything. But Grandma Maggie's letter echoed in her mind, be careful, be smart. I found some old papers of my grandmother's. Stock stuff from the 90s. I just want to know if they're worth anything. He called the transfer agent, the company that issued them. They'll have records. Judith studied her. These papers worth a lot. I don't know. Maybe. Then get a lawyer first, someone who specializes in estates. Don't try to handle it yourself. Wesley Grant, Eve's co-worker, came in through the back door carrying supplies. He was 26, had worked at the bakery for 3 years, and was relentlessly cheerful in a way that usually made Eve smile. Not today. Morning, hey Eve, you okay? You look like you saw a ghost. I'm fine. She wasn't fine. She was standing in a bakery making $9 an hour while carrying certificates worth millions in her locker. The disconnect was so absurd she almost laughed. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Lawrence Ashford, attorney at law. I've been expecting your call regarding Margaret Whitmore's estate. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. Eve's hands froze mid-need. She hadn't called him. She hadn't told anyone about finding the portfolio. So how did he know? Unless Grandma Maggie had left instructions. Unless the lawyer had been waiting for Eve to find what was hidden and some kind of trigger had alerted him. Or unless someone else had contacted him, someone like Vivian, asking about Grandma Maggie's will. Eve finished her shift in a daze, picked up Clara from daycare, and took the bus home. The whole ride she kept checking over her shoulder, expecting to see Derek or Frank or someone following them. At the apartment, Tyler Knox was waiting. Eve, we need to talk. I said I'm working on it. Yeah, well, working on it isn't good enough. He blocked the doorway. My dad's done being patient. You're out Friday, period. Unless, his eyes went to the backpack Eve was clutching. Unless you've got some money I don't know about. Get out of my way, Tyler. Whoa, attitude, that's new. He grinned, enjoying her distress. You know what I think? I think something's changed. I think maybe you found something in that ugly dresser after all. Eve's blood went cold. What are you talking about? Your sister called my dad this morning, said your grandma might have left you some money and maybe we should work with you on the rent situation. Tyler leaned closer. So, did she leave you money? Eve pushed past him into the apartment and slammed the door. Inside, she leaned against it, breathing hard. Vivian had called the landlord. Vivian had told Derek, or someone who'd told Derek. Vivian, who wanted to help, but really just wanted to know if there was anything worth claiming. Eve's phone rang. Vivian, she didn't answer. Instead, she opened her laptop and typed, Lawrence Ashford, attorney, San Francisco. His website came up immediately. Professional understated. Estate planning, trust management, probate law. A photo showed a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s, gray hair, kind eyes. Below his bio, Eve found something else. A news article from 1995. Lawrence Ashford Sr., prominent attorney, convicted of defrauding 40-plus clients out of $2.3 million in investment schemes spanning 1963 to 1994. Sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Eve read faster. Among the victims listed Margaret and William Whitmore, who lost $500 in 1963, equivalent to their entire life savings at the time. So Grandma Maggie's letter was right. Lawrence Ashford's father had defrauded her, and now the son was handling her estate. Why would Maggie hire the son of the man who'd ruined her? Keep your enemies close. The letter had said it explicitly. Maggie had hired Lawrence to watch him, to control what he knew to make sure he couldn't steal what she'd built. But how much did Lawrence actually know? Did he know about the $4.2 million in the dresser? Did he know about the $128 million supposedly hidden in the house? Only one way to find out. Eve took a deep breath and called the number on Lawrence Ashford's card. He answered on the second ring. Ms. Harper, I've been expecting your call. His voice was warm, professional, with just a hint of something Eve couldn't quite identify. Relief, anticipation. How did you know I'd call when your grandmother left very specific instructions? She said you'd contact me when you were ready. I wasn't to reach out, first you had to come to me. A pause. I take it you found what she left in the dresser. Eve's grip tightened on the phone. What do you know about what was in the dresser? Very little, actually. Margaret was careful about compartmentalizing information. She told me she'd left something for you to find, something that would convince you to take possession of the house. But she never told me what it was. The house at 127 Oak Street. Yes, are you familiar with it? I've been there a few times when I was young. I didn't know Grandma Maggie still owned it. She did, and according to her will, it's yours now. But there's a condition. Lawrence's voice remained pleasant, but Eve detected an edge now. You must live in the house for at least 6 months before you can sell or transfer ownership. If you don't fulfill this condition, the house transfers to your sister, Vivian. 6 months, just like the letter had said. Why how? Margaret didn't share her reasoning with me. She simply said you'd understand when the time came. Papers rustled on his end. I have the keys to the house whenever you're ready to take possession. The property has been vacant for 18 months since Margaret passed, but it's been maintained. Utilities are current. You could move in immediately if you wished. Move in immediately. Leave this apartment. Leave Tyler Knox and his threats. Leave Derek's drunken demands. What condition is the house in Birmingham? Livable, though it needs work. It's a Victorian built in 1912, 3 stories, plus a basement. Margaret lived there alone for 40 years after your grandfather passed. She was private about the property. I only saw the interior a handful of times in 38 years of representing her. Private, that was one word for it. Mr. Ashford, I need to ask you something directly. Of course. Your father defrauded my grandmother in 1963. He stole her life savings. Why would she hire you as her lawyer? Silence on the line. When Lawrence spoke again, his voice was quieter, more careful. She hired me in 2010 after my father passed. I reached out to her and to all of his victims to apologize for what he'd done. I offered pro bono legal services to help make amends for his crimes. A long pause. Margaret was the only one who accepted. But she made it clear she was hiring me, not forgiving me. She said she wanted to see if I was different from my father. I'd like to think I proved I was. Did she trust you? No. The answer was immediate, honest. She gave me access to some things, the house deed, basic estate documents. But she kept secrets, Ms. Harper. Lots of them. I suspect you're beginning to discover just how many. Eve made a decision. I'd like to see the house. Today, if possible. I can meet you there in 2 hours. Does that work? Yes. Excellent. And Eve, may I call you Eve? I know this must be overwhelming. Inheritance often is, even when it's expected. But whatever Margaret left you, she did it because she believed in you. Try to remember that. After hanging up, Eve sat on her futon and looked at Clara, who was coloring at the small table that served as their dining area. Baby, how would you feel about living in a big house like Grandma Maggie's house? Clara's eyes went wide. The one with all the rooms and the attic. That's the one. Could I have my own bedroom? A real one? Yes, you could have your own bedroom. Clara threw her arms around Eve's neck. I want to go. Can we go now, please? Eve hugged her daughter tight, smelling the baby shampoo in her hair, feeling the small, trusting weight of her. Soon, sweetheart. Very soon. She had 3 days to vacate this apartment. She had $4.2 million hidden in a backpack. She had a house waiting for her, a house supposedly containing $128 million in hidden assets. And she had Derek and Frank potentially circling a lawyer she couldn't fully trust, and a sister who was already spreading word about an inheritance that was supposed to be secret. The most valuable things aren't always the ones that shine. Grandma Maggie had been right about that. The dresser everyone called ugly and worthless had held the key to everything. And now Eve was about to find out what other secrets her grandmother had left behind. She looked at the dresser one more time, that battered piece of furniture that had traveled with her through every bad decision and worse luck, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone drowning. The real thing. Solid, earned. Whatever came next, IRS audits, family drama, hidden fortunes, or elaborate traps, Eve would face it. She'd survived Derek in poverty and 3 evictions in 2 years. She'd survived her daughter being born still, and silent survived the grief that nearly killed her. Survived getting back up every single day, even when staying down seemed easier. She could survive this too. And maybe, just maybe, she could do more than survive. Maybe she could actually live. The house felt like a living thing in those first days, creaking, settling, revealing secrets through drafts that whispered from walls and floorboards, that groaned under Eve's weight. She'd moved in with nothing but the clothes they owned, Clara's stuffed rabbit, and a backpack containing $4.2 million in stock, certificates, and bearer bonds that no one could know about. Beck Thornton appeared the morning after they arrived, carrying a toolbox and a thermos of coffee. Thought you might need help getting settled. He gestured at the broken window in the kitchen, the one Frank had photographed during his midnight reconnaissance. That window's been busted 3 months. Margaret called me about it before she passed, said she'd get to it eventually. Never did. They worked in comfortable silence, Beck measuring and cutting new glass while Eve scrubbed years of grime from countertops. Clara explored upstairs, her footsteps echoing through empty rooms, her voice calling out discoveries. Mommy, there's an attic. Mommy, one room has 1,000,000 books. By noon, the window was fixed. Beck declined payment, but accepted lunch sandwiches Eve made from supplies Pearl had sent over, eaten at the kitchen table that had probably hosted 50 years of Margaret's solitary meals. Your grandmother was a puzzle, Beck said, wiping mustard from his mouth. Lived here 40 years after William died. Never remarried, never seemed interested. Just worked her jobs, kept to herself, and maintained this house like it was a museum. But smart lord, she was smart. Used to read 3 newspapers a day, watch financial news like other folks watch sports. Did she seem wealthy to you? Beck laughed. Margaret, she drove a 1992 Corolla until it literally fell apart. Shopped at thrift stores, clipped coupons. If she had money, she sure didn't show it. He paused. But there were moments, like 10 years ago, she hired me to move something heavy down to the basement. Wouldn't tell me what, just said it was personal and to keep quiet about it. Paid me $500 cash for 2 hours work. Eve's heart quickened. What did you move? Safe, old Victorian thing, must have weighed 300 pounds. She had it delivered during the night, I remember, because the delivery guys complained about working at 2 a.m. We got it down to the basement, and she had me build a partition around it. Wood frame, plywood walls, nothing fancy, but it hid the safe completely. Beck's eyes sharpened. She made me promise never to mention it to anyone. Said it was her insurance policy. Do you know the combination? No. And she never told me what was inside. But Margaret didn't do anything without a reason. If she hid a safe that carefully, there's something important in there. After Beck left, Eve stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into darkness. The bulb at the bottom cast weak yellow light, illuminating rough concrete and the smell of old earth. Her hand found the railing, testing its stability before committing her weight. The basement was larger than she'd expected, divided into quadrants by support beams, and containing the detritus of decades broken furniture, boxes of old tax documents, paint cans dried to solid bricks. In the northeast corner, she found Beck's partition, crude 2x4s, and plywood forming a wall that served no structural purpose. She pulled one board loose. Behind it, barely visible in the shadows, sat an iron safe that belonged in a museum. 5 feet tall, scrollwork decorating the door, 4 keyholes arranged in a diamond pattern around a combination dial. On a brass plate near the bottom, Whitmore Family, 2015. Eve touched the cold metal, feeling the weight of secrets her grandmother had protected. 4 keyholes meant 4 keys. She'd found the portfolio in one hidden compartment. Maggie's letter had mentioned 2 more compartments in the dresser, which meant the keys were there waiting to be found if she was clever enough to locate them. But first she needed to handle the immediate crisis, converting her newfound wealth into something usable without triggering IRS investigations that would destroy everything. Thomas Brenner arrived the next morning in a sensible Honda, carrying a briefcase and the cautious demeanor of someone who'd seen too many people make catastrophic financial mistakes. Beck had vouched for him. Worked for the IRS 15 years, knows every rule and loophole, and his fee of $300 per hour felt simultaneously astronomical and necessary. They sat at Margaret's kitchen table, documents spread between them like evidence at a trial. Thomas examined the stock certificates with a jeweler's loupe, checking serial numbers against databases on his laptop. These are legitimate. Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, all properly issued, all transferable. Current value approximately $1.2 million. He looked up. You'll need to contact each company's transfer agent, send the physical certificates via registered mail with insurance, wait 4 to 6 weeks for conversion to electronic shares. During that time, the certificates are in limbo. You don't have access to the value, and if they're lost or stolen in transit, you're facing a legal nightmare to replace them. What about the bearer bonds? Thomas's expression darkened. Those are more complicated. Bearer bonds were phased out in 1982 precisely because they're untraceable. Whoever holds them owns them. No registration required. They're not illegal if issued before the cutoff date, but redeeming them triggers automatic currency transaction reports. The IRS will want proof your grandmother paid taxes on the annual interest. If she didn't, they can go back decades and claim tax evasion penalties, possibly criminal charges. Eve pulled out Margaret's ledgers, decades of meticulous record-keeping, every bond purchased, every interest payment documented, every tax form filed. Thomas flipped through pages, his eyes widening. Your grandmother was more sophisticated than most professional investors. She documented everything, kept perfect records, paid every penny of taxes owed. He tapped the ledger. This is your shield. With this documentation, we can demonstrate clean inheritance, no fraud, no evasion. You'll still owe capital gains taxes when you sell, probably $800,000 to $900,000, but you won't face criminal exposure. How long will the whole process take? 3 to 6 months for complete liquidation and tax clearance. But Ms. Harper, I need to warn you, the moment you start converting these assets, people will notice. Banks file reports. The IRS reviews large transactions. Anyone watching your accounts will see sudden wealth appearing. Thomas closed his briefcase. If someone wanted to make trouble, claim you're hiding assets, accuse you of fraud, now is when they'd do it. As if summoned by the prophecy, Eve's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Those bearer bonds are reportable within 72 hours of redemption. Miss that deadline equals automatic audit. Better get your paperwork in order. Frank, Eve showed Thomas the message. His jaw tightened. That's attempted intimidation. The 72-hour rule doesn't exist. He's making it up to scare you. But it tells me someone's been researching your situation, looking for vulnerabilities. He pulled out a business card. This is a colleague of mine, Marianne Foster, family law specialist. If your ex-husband is being manipulated by his brother to file custody claims, you'll need her. Eve hired Marianne on the spot, $400 per hour, estimated 20 hours of work, approximately $10,000 she didn't technically have access to yet, but could now afford. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, millionaire on paper, struggling to pay a retainer in practice. But Thomas had a solution. He'd help her open a new bank account, deposit $9,000 at a time from the cash in the safe just under the $10,000 reporting threshold, and use that to pay immediate expenses while the larger assets went through proper channels. It's called structuring if you're doing it to evade taxes, Thomas explained. But you're not evading, you're being strategic about timing. As long as everything is properly reported on your tax return, you're fine. The second hidden compartment in the dresser revealed itself 3 days later, after Eve had spent hours examining every inch of the furniture's construction. The first drawer, the one that had always stuck slightly, had a rear panel that seemed too thick. When she pressed the upper left corner while pulling the drawer out completely, something clicked deep in the wood. The panel swung open on hidden hinges. Inside, a USB drive, wrapped in plastic, and a note in Margaret's handwriting. Eve, this USB contains access information for online accounts I've maintained for the past decade. Banking, investment, cryptocurrency. Total value of approximately $31.7 million. The password is Clara's full name and birth date, no spaces format, Clara Harper 05212018. These accounts are held in trust structures Lawrence Ashford knows nothing about. They're yours free and clear, no probate required. Use them wisely. Eve's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the drive. 31.7 million, on top of the 4.2 in the dresser, on top of whatever was in the safe, on top of the house itself. How much had Margaret actually accumulated? She waited until Clara was asleep, then booted up. Margaret's old laptop disconnected from the internet, no way for anyone to track what she was accessing. The USB required a password. Eve typed Clara Harper 05212018. The drive opened like a treasure chest, files blooming across the screen in organized folders. Fidelity Brokerage, Vanguard Retirement Chase, such checking, Wells Fargo Savings, Coinbase Crypto, complete asset list. Eve opened the asset list first, her breath catching as she scrolled through 53 pages of meticulous documentation. Brokerage accounts as of June 2024. Fidelity 18,347,293, Vanguard 9721,847, E-Trade 356,902, totaling 30,26,42, cryptocurrency purchase 2013-2016. Bitcoin 47 BTC at what for 255 each, 4,995. Ethereum 380 ETH at 2241 each, Ethereum 851 580. Total of 752 565. Real estate beyond Oak Street, 489 Hayes Street, SF 650,000 rented, $2,800 month income. 1120 Fulton Street, SF $1,580,000 rented, $3,100 month income. It total $330,000. Irrevocable trust, Northern Trust established 2015. Managed portfolio 96,432,718. Activation date June 15, 26, 2 years after grantor's death. Initial distribution to beneficiary, $5,000. Subsequent distributions, $10 million annually for 5 years. Final distribution after year 6. Remaining balance, safe deposit box, Wells Fargo Market Street, box of 2847. Contents, jewelry. Documents, historical records. Storage unit, public storage, 1550 Bryant Street, unit numbered B302. Contents, artwork, antiques, collectibles, est. Value, $400,000, $600,000. Total net worth at time of death, $141. Here it's 73,325, $141 million. Eve read the number 3 times before it penetrated. Her grandmother, who'd lived in this house eating canned soup and wearing coats from Goodwill, had died worth more than some small country's GDP. And she'd hidden it so thoroughly that even her own lawyer didn't know the full extent. At the bottom of the document, a final note. Eve, the irrevocable trust is managed by Helena Blackwood Wealth Management and Northern Trust Company. Lawrence Ashford has no access and no knowledge of this trust. The corporate trustee structure ensures no single person can steal or mismanage these funds. When the trust activates in 2026, you will be independently wealthy beyond anything you can currently imagine. But you must survive the next year first. Be careful. Be smart. And remember, the fortune isn't the point. What you do with it is the point. Eve closed the laptop and sat in darkness, the weight of Margaret's legacy pressing down like atmosphere at ocean depth. This wasn't just money. It was responsibility, expectation, a test she hadn't asked to take but couldn't refuse. The USB drive had one more folder, contact information. Inside, a single entry, Helena Blackwood, wealth manager, do not contact until ready. A phone number, an email address, and instructions. Helena knows everything about the trust. She has been waiting for you to find this information. When you call her, say, Margaret told me it was time. She will understand. Eve memorized the number but didn't call. Not yet. First, she needed to find the keys to the safe. Because if Margaret had hidden $31 million in online accounts, What had she hidden in that iron fortress in the basement? The third hidden compartment revealed itself almost accidentally. Clara had been playing with the dresser, pretending it was a castle, pulling drawers in and out, while narrating an elaborate story about princesses and dragons. When she yanked the third drawer too hard, something shifted inside the frame, not breaking, but clicking like a mechanism engaging. Eve investigated after Clara went to bed. The third drawer's bottom had a seam she'd never noticed, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. When she pressed both back corners simultaneously, the false bottom released, springing up slightly to reveal the compartment beneath. Inside, 4 keys on a ring, each labeled with a small brass tag. Northeast, Southwest, Center, Final. And a note. The combination is the date William died. He's still protecting us even now. William had died September 1st, 1963. That would make the combination 090163. Eve took the keys and went down to the basement, her phone's flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to resist illumination. The safe loomed like a monument to secrets, its iron skin cold and unyielding. She tried the first key in the top keyhole, the one marked Northeast. It turned smoothly, releasing one lock with a deep clunk. Second key left side, third key right side, fourth key bottom. Each lock disengaged with mechanical precision, decades-old mechanisms still functioning perfectly. But the door didn't open. She still needed the combination. Eve spun the dial to 0, then began the sequence, right to 9 left, to 1 right to 63. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something deep inside the safe shifted gears, engaging, and the door swung open with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in years. The interior was organized in shelves, each containing different treasures. Top shelf, emergency cash and bank wrappers, still crisp, approximately $300,000 in $100 bills. Second shelf, 15 gold bars each stamped 1Os 9999 fine gold, approximately $30,000 at current prices. Third shelf, real estate documents, deeds for the 2 rental properties, tenant agreements, income records showing Margaret had been collecting rent for 15 years. Fourth shelf, a red folder thicker than the others labeled in Margaret's precise handwriting, evidence, Ashford family fraud. Eve lifted the folder with trembling hands and carried it upstairs into better light. Inside were documents that told a story of calculated revenge, spanning decades. Section 1, Historical Fraud Documentation. Original investment contract from 1963. William and Margaret investing $500 with Lawrence Ashford Sr. Bank records showing the money was stolen then never invested. Police reports from Margaret's attempts to press charges, all dismissed. Newspaper clippings about Ashford Sr.'s eventual conviction in 1995. Section 2, Contemporary Surveillance. Recorded phone conversations between Margaret and Lawrence Jr., dated 2022, 2023. Transcripts of those conversations showing Lawrence pressuring Margaret to sell the house below market value. Emails between Lawrence and a developer named Marcus Chen discussing profit sharing if they could convince the old woman to sell. Documentation of fabricated legal fees, invoices for work, never performed hours, never billed charges that appeared only after Margaret refused to sell. Section 3, Legal Preparation. A notarized letter to the California Bar Association dated 3 weeks before Margaret's death, detailing systematic elder abuse and fraud. Witness statements from Beck and Pearl documenting suspicious behavior. Financial analysis showing Lawrence stood to profit $200,000 plus from forcing a below-market sale. The letter to the Bar Association was particularly damning. I am writing to report systematic fraud and attempted financial elder abuse by attorney Lawrence Ashford Jr., State Bar number 284756. Over the past 18 months, Mr. Ashford has pressured me to sell my property at 127 Oak Street for $650,000 market value, $850,000 on plus 2, fabricated legal fees totaling $15,000 for services never rendered, conspired with outside parties to profit from my estate, 4, threatened to claim I lacked capacity to manage my affairs if I didn't comply with his demands. I have recorded our conversations with proper one-party consent under California law and preserved all email correspondence. Mr. Ashford is unaware I have documented his fraud. I am holding this letter until after my death, at which point my granddaughter Eve Harper will decide whether to file it. If she chooses to pursue this matter, she has my full support and all necessary evidence to destroy Mr. Ashford's career and potentially secure his criminal prosecution. The letter was signed, notarized, and sealed in an envelope addressed to the State Bar's Ethics Committee. All Eve had to do was mail it, or use it as leverage. Margaret had left the choice to her granddaughter justice or pragmatism, public destruction, or private resolution. Eve photographed every page, uploaded the images to an encrypted cloud account Thomas had helped her establish, then carefully returned the originals to the safe. She now held Lawrence Ashford's entire career in her hands. One envelope in the mail, and he'd lose his law license, face disbarment proceedings, possibly criminal charges for elder abuse and conspiracy to commit fraud. But that would take time, months, maybe years of legal proceedings. Time Eve didn't have, not with Frank and Derek circling like sharks who'd scented blood in the water. Better to confront Lawrence directly, show him what she had, and make him disappear from her life permanently. She called his office at 9 a.m. His secretary answered with professional warmth. Mr. Ashford is in meetings all morning, but I can schedule you for... Tell him Eve Harper needs to see him within the next hour, or I'll be filing formal complaints with the Bar Association by noon. He'll understand. Silence on the line. Then, please hold. Lawrence himself came on 30 seconds later, his voice strained. Eve, there's no need for threats. I'm sure we can discuss whatever concerns you have. 1 hour, your office, this isn't a negotiation. She hung up before he could respond, adrenaline singing through her veins. This was power, not the money in the safe, but the knowledge that she held someone else's fate in her hands, and he knew it. Beck drove her to Lawrence's office, insisting she shouldn't go alone. If this lawyer's dirty, no telling what he might try when cornered. I'll wait in the lobby, make sure you come out safe. Lawrence met them in the reception area, not inviting Eve into his private office. His face was pale, professional smile barely masking panic. Eve, what's this about? She handed him a manila envelope containing copies, not originals, of the most damaging evidence. He opened it with shaking hands, flipped through the first few pages, and his face went gray. I can explain. No explanations. Here's what's going to happen. Eve's voice was steady, cold, in a way she'd never heard from herself before. You're going to draft and sign a document stating that Margaret Whitmore's estate is settled in full, that she owed you nothing, and that you relinquish any and all claims to her property, assets, or estate. You will cease all contact with me and my family permanently. If I ever hear from you again, if you ever speak my name to anyone, if you ever attempt to interfere in my life, I will file this evidence with the Bar Association, the district attorney, and every major newspaper in California. Those recordings might not be admissible in court. They're admissible in Bar Association ethics proceedings. And even if they weren't, the court of public opinion doesn't require warrants. Prominent attorney attempted to defraud dying client. That's a headline that ends careers regardless of what a judge says. Lawrence stared at the document's jaw, working silently. Finally, you want this in writing? By tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., I'll return with witnesses and a notary. You sign, I leave, and this evidence stays exactly where it is, locked away forever, unless you give me a reason to use it. And if I refuse, then I mail the originals to the Bar Association at 9:15, and you spend the next 5 years fighting disbarment and criminal charges. Your choice. She walked out, Beck, following neither of them, looking back at the man who'd tried to steal an old woman's life savings and failed because his victim had been smarter, more patient, and infinitely more ruthless than he'd ever suspected. Outside, standing in autumn sunlight that felt too bright, after the dim office, Eve realized her hands weren't shaking. The fear that had defined her entire adult life, fear of landlords, creditors, Derek, anyone with power over her circumstances, had evaporated. She had resources now. Knowledge, leverage. She wasn't helpless anymore. But that realization came with a price. Frank DeLuca escalated the moment he sensed Eve was gaining strength rather than breaking under pressure. The black SUV was parked across from the Oak Street house when Beck dropped her off, Frank behind the wheel, making no effort to hide his surveillance. Eve walked straight to her front door, didn't acknowledge him, went inside and locked every lock while Clara watched with wide, frightened eyes. Mommy, who's that man? Someone who made a mistake, thinking we're easy targets. She called Detective Caroline Reeves, the officer who'd responded to Derek's drunken door pounding what felt like years ago, but was actually less than 2 weeks. Frank DeLuca is parked outside my house. 4th time this week. He's not technically trespassing, but it's clearly intimidation. Has he threatened you directly? In text messages. Eve read them aloud, Frank's carefully worded attempts to sound helpful, while making her understand the consequences of noncompliance. Detective Reeves sighed. Without explicit threats, there's not much I can do. Parking on a public street isn't illegal, but keep documenting everything, times, dates, license plates, any witnesses. If he escalates to actual trespass or contact, call 911 immediately. That night past midnight, the back door handle rattled. Eve was still awake sitting in Margaret's study reviewing trust documents when she heard it, someone testing the lock, trying to be quiet. But the old hardware betrayed every movement. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911, and spoke quietly. Someone's trying to break into my house. 127 Oak Street. I have a 7-year-old daughter here. The dispatcher kept her on the line while patrol cars were dispatched. Eve crept to Clara's room, locked them both inside, and waited with a baseball bat Beck had insisted she keep for precisely this situation. The back door handle stopped rattling. Footsteps retreated across the yard. By the time police arrived 5 minutes later, whoever had been there was gone, but they found fresh footprints in the dirt beneath the window, size 12 men's shoes and tool marks on the doorframe where someone had attempted to jimmy the lock. You should install a security system, the responding officer said, examining the damage. Cameras, motion sensors, the works. This neighborhood's gotten worse in the past few years. Beck arranged it the next morning, calling in favors from a friend who installed commercial security systems. By evening, the house had 8 cameras covering every entrance, motion-activated lights, and alarms that would wake the entire block if someone tried to breach a door or window. The equipment cost $3,000. Eve paid cash from the safe money that had probably been sitting in darkness for a decade, waiting for exactly this kind of emergency. Frank's SUV didn't appear the next day or the day after. But that didn't mean the threat had passed. It meant he was regrouping, finding a new angle of attack. The angle arrived in the form of Derek standing on the porch at 7 a.m. with court documents clutched in one shaking hand. Eve opened the door but didn't invite him inside. What is this petition for modification of parental rights? Derek wouldn't meet her eyes. Frank says I should fight for Clara. Says she deserves a father, and you can't keep her from me just because I made mistakes. Eve took the documents, scanned them quickly. Filed yesterday, hearing scheduled in 3 weeks. Claims of 6 months sobriety, stable employment at Frank's construction company, desire to establish meaningful relationship with daughter. You don't want this, Derek. Frank wants this. There's a difference. He says you're rich now, says Clara should benefit from both parents' resources. I'm not rich. I'm managing an inheritance that's tied up in probate and taxes. Eve stepped onto the porch, forcing Derek back. But even if I had money, you have no legal claim to it. You terminated your rights voluntarily 6 years ago. You haven't seen Clara since she was 9 months old. You don't know her favorite color, her best friend's name, what she's afraid of, or what makes her laugh. You're not her father. You're a stranger who happens to share her DNA. Derek's face crumpled. Frank says courts favor reunification. Courts favor the child's best interest. And Clara's best interest isn't being dragged through custody evaluations and therapy sessions because your brother thinks there's a payout. Eve's voice softened slightly. Derek, if you actually want to get sober, if you actually want to build a life worth living, I'll help you. I'll give you information about good rehab programs, job training that isn't at Frank's company. But I won't give you money, and I won't give you access to Clara until you've proven you're stable. How long would that take? Years, minimum 2 years of documented sobriety, consistent employment therapy to address whatever drove you to alcohol in the first place. She handed the court documents back. Or you can go forward with this petition, waste tens of thousands on lawyers, traumatize your daughter, and lose anyway because no judge is going to overturn a voluntary termination of rights based on 6 months of alleged sobriety and a construction job your brother gave you. Derek stood there holding the papers, uncertainty written across every feature. Finally, I don't know if I can do 2 years. Then you're not ready to be in Clara's life. Come back when you are. He left without another word, and Eve called Marianne Foster immediately. Derek filed the petition. Expected. I'll draft our response. It'll be straightforward. California Family Code is very clear about modification of terminated parental rights. He needs to prove extraordinary circumstances and that reunification serves Clara's best interest. He has neither. Marianne's voice was brisk, confident. The hearing will likely be dismissed at the first appearance, but I'll prepare as if we're going to trial. My retainer is $10,000 as discussed. Can you manage that? Eve had cash in a safe deposit box. Thomas had helped her secure $9,000 deposited in increments, legally structured, properly documented. Yes. Good. I'll file our response today and request an expedited hearing date. The sooner we get this dismissed, the sooner we can move on to getting you a permanent restraining order against Frank DeLuca. After hanging up, Eve sat with Clara and tried to explain what was happening in terms a 7-year-old could understand. You remember your father? Clara shook her head. I've seen pictures, but I don't remember him. He wants to visit you. but it might not happen because he hasn't been in your life for a long time. Eve chose words carefully, not wanting to poison Clara Bush against the man who might someday genuinely reform, but not wanting to give false hope either. If it does happen, it will be in a safe place with other adults there. You won't be alone with him. And if you don't want to see him, you can tell the judge, and they'll listen to you. I don't want to see him. He left us. Clara's voice was matter of fact, not angry, just stating reality as she understood it. You didn't leave. You stayed. That's what matters. Out of the mouths of children came the truths adults spent fortunes on therapy to uncover. That night, after Clara was asleep, Eve returned to Margaret's study and opened the laptop. She needed to understand the full scope of what her grandmother had built, needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The USB drive's files painted a picture of obsessive planning spanning decades. Margaret hadn't just accumulated wealth she'd structured, it protected it, created systems that would survive her death and deliver the fortune to Eve without interference from lawyers, family, or anyone else who might try to claim it. The irrevocable trust was the crown jewel $96 million managed by professionals. Margaret had vetted personally structured, so no single person could steal or mismanage the funds. Helena Blackwood had been managing Margaret's wealth since 2012, according to the files. 14 years of consistent returns, careful allocation, and absolute discretion. Eve found Helena's phone number in the contacts folder attached to a note. Call her when you're ready. She's waiting. But was Eve ready? Ready to step into a world of wealth management, trust, structures, tax strategies that required professional expertise she didn't possess. Margaret's final video file was also on the laptop, separate from the one Helena supposedly had. This version was marked private, watch first. Eve clicked play. Margaret's face appeared so thin, the bones showed through papery skin, recording this maybe days before she died. Her voice was weak, but her eyes burned with that intelligence Eve remembered from childhood. Eve, my darling, if you're watching this version, you have found everything in the correct order. The portfolio in the dresser, proving you kept what others called worthless. The USB drive, showing you the scale of what I built. The safe revealing the evidence against Lawrence. Good. You've earned what comes next. Margaret coughed, recovered, continued. The trust activates June 15, 2026, exactly 2 years after my death. That gives you 7 months from now to learn how to handle wealth before you have access to the largest portion. Use this time wisely. Make mistakes with the smaller amounts so you don't make catastrophic mistakes with the 96 million. She leaned closer to the camera. But Eve, I need to tell you something I never could while alive. This fortune, all of it, was built on revenge. When William died because Lawrence Ashford Sr. destroyed our lives, I swore I'd prove I was better than them. Smarter. Stronger. I'd build an empire on the ruins of what they took from us. Tears tracked down Margaret's cheeks. And I succeeded. I became wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. But Eve, it didn't make me happy. I spent 60 years protecting this money, hiding it, living in fear that someone would take it. I never traveled, never remarried, never took risks or built friendships or did anything that might expose my secrets. I won the game, but I lost my life playing it. The image shook as Margaret shifted the camera. Don't make my mistakes. You have resources now that most people only dream about. Use them to build something beautiful, not just to protect yourself from pain. Help people. Take risks. Let Clara see a mother who's brave enough to be generous, not just smart enough to be careful. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. The most valuable things aren't always the ones that shine, but sometimes, darling, it's okay to let yourself shine too. Be brave. Be bold. Be everything I was too frightened to become. The video ended with Margaret's hand reaching toward the camera and then darkness. Eve sat in that darkness for a long time, Margaret's words echoing in the silence. Don't make my mistakes. Outside, a car engine started Frank's SUV, leaving its surveillance post as predictable as tides. Inside, Clara slept peacefully in her first real bedroom, safe behind locks and cameras, in the invisible protection of wealth she didn't know existed yet. And Eve sat between those two realities, threat and safety, poverty and fortune, the life she'd lived and the life she might build, trying to decide who she wanted to become. The answer, she realized, wasn't actually difficult. Margaret had shown her the path by revealing what not to do. Don't hide, don't hoard, don't let fear turn wealth into a prison. Use it, transform it, make it mean something beyond numbers and accounts. Eve opened a new document and began typing the Margaret Whitmore Foundation, preliminary mission statement. By morning, she had 10 pages outlining programs for single mothers, childcare assistance, eviction prevention, legal aid for custody battles, job training that didn't assume you had reliable transportation or childcare already solved. Everything she'd needed when she was drowning, everything Margaret would have wanted her to create. She'd fund it with $10 million from the trust once it activated. Endow it with another $20 million to ensure it operated in perpetuity. Keep the rest for Clara's future and their security. It wouldn't bring Margaret back. Wouldn't erase William's death or the decades Margaret spent in self-imposed isolation. But it would mean something. It would take all that carefully hoarded fortune and pour it into the world like water onto parched earth, sustaining life instead of gathering dust in darkness. The phone rang. Thomas Brenner calling with an update. I've submitted preliminary tax documentation to the IRS. They'll review it, probably ask for additional information, but everything is properly supported. You're operating completely above board. A pause. But Eve, I need to warn you, the bearer bonds redemption is going to take months. The financial institutions that handle them have to verify authenticity, check for fraud, confirm your grandmother's tax history. During that time, the bonds are essentially frozen. You can't access the $3 million until the process completes. How long? 4 to 6 months minimum, maybe longer if they find any discrepancies in the historical records. So she had access to the online accounts, 31 million, once she worked through the security protocols and the cash from the safe. But the bonds were locked up and the trust wouldn't activate until June. Still more wealth than she'd ever imagined, but not the instant liquidity that would solve every problem immediately. Which meant she still had to navigate the next 6 months carefully. Derek's custody petition, Frank's threats, Lawrence's potential retaliation if he decided fighting was better than capitulating. Eve thanked Thomas and hung up, then stared at Helena Blackwood's number. Time to take the next step. Time to stop being the person things happened to and become the person who made things happen. She dialed. Helena answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. This is Helena Blackwood. Margaret told me it was time. A pause, then Eve Harper. I've been waiting for your call. Margaret said you'd find everything when you were ready and you'd know what to say. Helena's tone warmed slightly. I imagine you have questions. About 3 million of them. Let's start with the basics. Can you meet me tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. at my office in the financial district? Bring any documentation you've found, trust papers, account information, anything Margaret left for you. We'll go through everything together. I'll be there. After hanging up, Eve realized she was smiling. Not the tired automatic smile she'd worn for years while serving coffee to people who didn't see her. A real smile built on something stronger than hope. Tomorrow she'd meet with Helena and learn how to manage the fortune Margaret had built. Next week she'd watch Lawrence Ashford sign away any claims to her life. In 3 weeks she'd sit in a courtroom and watch Derek's petition get dismissed. And in 6 months when the trust activated and she had access to $96 million, she'd establish the Margaret Whitmore Foundation and start transforming lives the way her grandmother had transformed hers. The most valuable things aren't always the ones that shine, but sometimes you could take what was hidden and make it shine for everyone. Helena Blackwood's office occupied the 43rd floor of a glass tower that reflected San Francisco Bay like a mirror catching sky. Eve stood in the lobby feeling acutely conscious of her thrift store blazer and scuffed shoes while everyone around her wore confidence tailored by designers whose names she didn't know. The receptionist smiled with professional warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ms. Harper, Ms. Blackwood is expecting you. Conference room C. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay furniture that probably cost more than Eve's car, and Helena Blackwood rising from her seat with a hand extended in greeting. She was 41, black with natural hair, styled in elegant locks, and the kind of presence that commanded rooms without effort. Her handshake was firm, assured. Eve, thank you for coming. Please sit. Helena gestured to a chair positioned so sunlight warmed without blinding, a deliberate choice that made Eve feel slightly less like she was being interrogated. Margaret spoke about you often. She was proud of how you'd survived challenges that would have broken most people. Raising Clara alone, working multiple jobs, never giving up despite every reason to quit. Helena pulled out a tablet, began calling up files. She wanted you to have this fortune not because you were family, but because you'd already proven you understood the difference between value and price. I'm not sure I understand anything right now except that I'm terrified of making mistakes. Good. Fear of mistakes means you'll think before acting. Helena turned the tablet so Eve could see. Let me show you what Margaret built. The presentation was comprehensive, methodical, designed for someone with no financial background. Helena explained the irrevocable trust structure, how Margaret had transferred most of her assets into a legal entity separate from her personal estate, managed by corporate trustees who couldn't be influenced or corrupted. The trust activates June 15th, 2026. That's approximately 5 months from now. When it does, you'll receive an initial distribution of $5 million, then $10 million annually for 5 years. The remainder, about $41 million, after the structured distributions transfers to you at the end of year 6. Why spread it out? Margaret's instructions. She wanted you to learn wealth management, gradually make mistakes with smaller amounts rather than catastrophic ones with the full sum. She also wanted protection mechanisms in place. Helena pulled up another screen. If at any point the trustees determine you're being coerced, defrauded, or manipulated, distributions pause until the situation resolves. It's a safeguard against exactly the kind of threats you're currently facing. Eve's throat tightened. You know about Frank and Derek. Margaret briefed me on your family's situation 2 years ago. She predicted they'd come after you the moment they suspected inheritance. That's why she structured everything so defensively. Helena closed the tablet. But Eve, the trust is only part of what you have access to. The online accounts, the 31 million in brokerage and banking, those are available now. They're held in separate trust structures Margaret established years ago, specifically to avoid probate. As beneficiary, you can access them immediately once we complete the verification protocols. She pulled out physical documents, each marked with official stamps and notary seals. These are the access instructions. Each account requires multi-factor authentication, biometric verification, and documentation proving you're Margaret's heir. It's a process, but it's designed to protect you. No one can steal these funds even if they obtain your passwords, because the institutions require in-person verification at their main branches. They spent 2 hours going through every account, every security protocol, every protection Margaret had built into the system. By the end, Eve's head spun with information about asset allocation, tax advantage structures, diversification, strategies. This is overwhelming, she admitted. It's supposed to be, but you don't have to understand everything immediately. That's what I'm here for, to manage the technical details while you make the big picture decisions. Helena leaned forward. So let me ask, what do you want to do with this wealth? The question hung in air-conditioned silence. What did she want? Help people, single mothers specifically. Women in situations where was in evictions, custody battles, working 3 jobs, and still falling behind. I want to create programs that actually solve problems instead of just offering sympathy. Helena's expression shifted, something like approval warming her professional demeanor. Margaret hoped you'd say something like that. She left a video message for you, recorded 3 weeks before she died. Are you ready to watch it? Eve nodded, not trusting her voice. Helena pulled out a laptop, queued up a video file, and turned the screen toward Eve. Margaret appeared so frail the hospital gown seemed to swallow her, but her eyes still burned with that fierce intelligence that had defined her entire life. Hello, Eve. If Helena is showing you this, you've made it past Lawrence Ashford found all my secrets and reached out for help managing them. I'm proud of you. The image shook slightly as Margaret adjusted the camera. I need to tell you the full story, everything I never could while alive. Your grandfather, William, died September 1st, 1963. Not from natural causes, not really. He died from a heart attack brought on by stress and despair after Lawrence Ashford Sr. stole our life savings. $500, everything we had. William couldn't handle the betrayal. 3 months later, he was gone. I was 31 years old, pregnant with your mother, completely alone. Tears formed in Margaret's eyes but didn't fall. The police wouldn't investigate. Ashford had connections, paid the right people. So I decided I'd get revenge another way, not with violence, but with success. I took the $340 we had left and bought stock in a computer company everyone said would fail. Then I worked every job I could find, saved every penny, bought more stock. Patient, methodical, never giving up. The video cut to different footage, Margaret looking healthier, probably recorded years earlier. By 1990, I had $800,000. I sold half, bought Apple when Steve Jobs came back. Bought Amazon when everyone said online bookstores made no sense. Bought Microsoft after the dot-com crash when it was trading at historical lows. The money compounded. Millions became tens of millions. Another cut back to the hospital room. But Eve, I never touched it. Never spent a penny more than my Social Security and William's pension, because I wanted the Ashfords to think they'd destroyed us. Wanted them to see me struggling, to never suspect I'd built an empire under their noses. That was my revenge, being richer than they ever were, and them never knowing until it was too late to steal it. Margaret's voice dropped. In 2010, Lawrence Ashford Jr. reached out to apologize for his father's crimes, offered pro bono legal services to make amends. I hired him, but not because I forgave him. I wanted to test whether he was different from his father or if corruption ran in the blood. Her face hardened. Took me 13 years to get my answer. He's a con man, Eve. Smoother than his father, more patient, but cut from the same cloth. In 2023, he tried to pressure me into selling this house below market value. When I refused, he invented legal fees to force my hand. I recorded everything, saved every email, built a case that could destroy his career. The camera zoomed closer, Margaret's face filling the frame. You found that evidence in the safe. Now you have a choice: destroy Lawrence publicly or confront him privately and make him disappear from your life. I recommend the second option, not because I forgive him, but because legal battles consume time and energy you'll need for better things. Margaret's expression softened. But Eve, here's what matters most. I spent 60 years building this fortune to prove I was better than the people who destroyed us. And I succeeded. I became wealthy beyond imagination. But it didn't make me happy. I was so busy protecting my money that I forgot to live. I never traveled, never remarried, never took the risks that make life worth living. She reached toward the camera as if she could touch Eve through the screen. Don't make my mistakes. Use this wealth to build something beautiful. Help people. Be generous. Let Clara see a mother who's brave enough to shine, not just smart enough to hide. A long pause. The most valuable things aren't always the ones that shine, but sometimes, darling, you have to be willing to stand in the light anyway. The video ended. Eve sat staring at the blank screen, tears streaming down her face while Helena waited in respectful silence. Finally, Eve managed. She carried that pain for 60 years and transformed it into something that will change your life and the lives of everyone you choose to help. Helena handed Eve a tissue. The question is, what will you do with that transformation? Build the foundation she wanted. Programs for single mothers, eviction prevention, legal aid, child care assistance, everything I needed when I was drowning. Then let's start planning. But first you need to handle the immediate threats. Lawrence Ashford, Frank DeLuca, Derek's custody petition. Those have to be resolved before you can focus on building something new. Eve wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders. Lawrence is handled. I'm meeting him tomorrow morning to sign his release. Derek's custody hearing is in 3 weeks. Frank, she hesitated. Frank's the real danger. He won't stop unless I make him stop. Then we make him stop, but carefully, legally, in ways that don't expose you to retaliation. Helena pulled out a business card. This is Marcus Webb, former FBI agent, who now runs private security. If Frank escalates, Marcus can help. Call him if you need to. They spent another hour discussing logistics, how to access the online accounts, which expenses Eve could pay immediately, how to structure withdrawals to minimize tax exposure, while the bearer bonds worked through their redemption process. By the time Eve left Helena's office, she had a clear picture of her financial situation: 31 million accessible within weeks, 5 million more arriving in June when the trust activated, and resources enough to hire the best lawyers, security, and advisors money could buy. She wasn't helpless anymore. She was dangerous. Lawrence Ashford's office the next morning was a study in barely controlled panic. He drafted the release. Eve demanded 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to, I have no claims, I will never contact you. I acknowledge all fees were paid in full. Thomas Brenner and Beck Thornton sat as witnesses. Beck's presence adding a layer of intimidation that wasn't strictly necessary, but satisfied something primal in Eve's need for protection. Lawrence signed without meeting her eyes, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote his name. This evidence you have stays exactly where it is as long as you honor this agreement. Eve took the signed document, had Thomas verify its completeness. But Lawrence understands something I'm not, Margaret. She hid her strength behind fear. I won't. If you ever come near me or my family again, I won't hesitate to destroy you. She walked out feeling 10 feet tall, though the sensation lasted only until she got home and found Derek sitting on her porch steps looking small and defeated. Frank says I'm a coward for not fighting. His voice was barely audible. Says real men don't let women take their kids. Eve sat beside him, maintaining distance, but not hostility. Frank's wrong. Real men prioritize their children's well-being over their pride. Real fathers show up consistently, not just when there's money involved. She pulled out her phone, showed him a photo of Clara. From this morning gap-toothed smile holding a drawing she'd made. This is your daughter. She doesn't remember you. To her, you're a stranger. Is that what you want to fight for? The legal right to traumatize a 7-year-old who's finally stable? Derek stared at the photo, something breaking in his expression. I don't know how to be a father. Then learn. But learn for the right reasons, not because Frank convinced you there's a payout. Go to rehab, real rehab, not just AA meetings. Get therapy. Build a life worth inviting a child into. If you do that, if you genuinely become someone stable and safe, we can talk about supervised visits in a year or two. A year. Minimum, and that's only if you're actually sober and working on yourself. Eve stood. But Derek, if you go forward with this custody petition just to please Frank, I will fight you with everything I have. And I will win because judges don't overturn voluntary termination of rights for someone who's been absent 6 years and suddenly reappears when there's money involved. He left without another word, and Eve called Marianne Foster to brief her. Good, Marianne said after hearing the conversation. If he withdraws the petition voluntarily, that's ideal. If not, we're fully prepared to contest it. But Eve, we need to talk about Frank DeLuca. His harassment is escalating, and Derek's petition is just one front. Has he made any direct contact recently? Not since the restraining order hearing was scheduled. He will. Men like Frank don't accept defeat gracefully. They probe for weaknesses, then exploit them. You need to be ready for whatever comes next. Whatever came next arrived 2 days later in the form of a Child Protective Services inspection, anonymous complaint alleging unsafe living conditions, inadequate heating, possible neglect. The inspector was a tired-looking man in his 40s named Robert Chen, who walked through the house with a clipboard, checking every room, asking questions, interviewing Clara Barrows separately. Eve had anticipated this. The house was immaculate windows, repaired mold, remediated space heaters providing warmth until she could afford a new furnace. Clara's room had books, toys, clean clothes. The refrigerator held fresh food. Nothing for CPS to criticize. After 45 minutes, Robert handed Eve his report. Everything's in order. No safety concerns, no signs of neglect. Clara's healthy bonded with you, clearly thriving. He paused. Between us, this complaint felt retaliatory. The details were too specific, like someone documented issues before they were fixed. If the person who filed this contacts us again, we'll start investigating them for harassment. It was my ex-husband's brother, Frank DeLuca. He's trying to build a case that I'm unfit. Robert made a note. I'll include that context in my report. If he files again, we'll flag it as potential abuse of the system. He handed Eve a card. Call me directly if you have concerns. CPS exists to protect children, not to be weaponized by vindictive relatives. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Frank forced an earlier confrontation by showing up at Clara's school during pickup. Pearl had been collecting Clara, an arrangement Eve had made specifically to avoid predictable routines Frank could exploit. But Pearl called in a panic. Frank DeLuca's here talking to the principal, claiming he's Clara's uncle and concerned about her welfare. Eve arrived to find Frank in the school office, all charm and concern, explaining to Principal Anderson that his brother Derek was attempting to reconnect with his daughter, but Eve was making false allegations to prevent it. I'm just trying to facilitate healthy family relationships, Frank said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Derek's been sober 6 months, working steadily, and he has every right to know how his daughter's doing. Eve walked in and the temperature dropped. Principal Anderson, this man has a restraining order hearing scheduled against him for harassment and stalking. He's not Clara's uncle in any meaningful sense. He's a convicted criminal, using family connections as an excuse to intimidate me. Frank's mask slipped for just a moment, anger flashing before the smile returned. Eve, I'm just here to talk. No need for dramatics. You're at my daughter's school without permission or legitimate reason. That's harassment. She turned to the principal. If he's here when I leave, I'm calling the police. And I'll be speaking to the superintendent about security protocols that allow convicted criminals to access school grounds. Principal Anderson, caught between competing claims, chose the path of least liability. Mr. DeLuca, I'll need to ask you to leave. If you have legitimate concerns about a student's welfare, you can file them through proper channels. But you can't simply appear and demand information. Frank left, but not before leaning close to Eve and whispering, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." The restraining order hearing was 3 days later, and Frank arrived with a lawyer, a slick corporate type named Jeffrey Morris, who specialized in making criminals look respectable. Morris argued that Frank had done nothing illegal, that Eve's accusations were fabricated to prejudice the court against Derek's legitimate custody petition, and that a restraining order would constitute harassment of someone simply trying to help his brother. Marianne countered with documentation, Frank's text messages, photos of him parked outside Eve's house on multiple occasions, the CPS complaint that bore hallmarks of his involvement, testimony from Beck about the attempted break-in, security camera footage showing someone matching Frank's description testing the back door lock. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Morales, who'd clearly seen this pattern before, reviewed everything carefully. Mr. DeLuca, I'm granting a temporary restraining order, effective immediately. You are to stay at least 100 yards from Ms. Harper, her daughter, her residence, and Clara's school. No direct or indirect contact, no surveillance, no involvement in Derek Sullivan's custody proceedings. Judge Morales looked over her reading glasses. If you violate this order, you'll be held in contempt and face potential criminal charges. Do you understand? Frank's face was stone. Yes, Your Honor. Good. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks for a permanent restraining order hearing. Ms. Harper, document any violations immediately. Outside the courthouse, Marianne pulled Eve aside. That's a good outcome, but temporary orders only last 3 weeks. We'll need to petition for a permanent one, which requires another hearing and more evidence. In the meantime, Frank will probably advise Derek to withdraw the custody petition. It's their only move left if they can't intimidate you. And if Derek doesn't withdraw, then we go to court in 2 weeks and watch his petition get dismissed. California judges don't overturn voluntary termination of parental rights without extraordinary circumstances, and 6 months of alleged sobriety plus sudden interest in child when mother receives inheritance doesn't qualify. Derek withdrew the petition 4 days later, leaving a voicemail that managed to be both apologetic and resentful. Eve, I'm dropping the custody thing. Frank's pissed, but I can't do this. I'm not ready to be a dad. Maybe someday, but not now. Tell Clara. Tell her I'm sorry. Eve saved the voicemail, forwarded it to Marianne as documentation, and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: relief. The threats were contained. Lawrence had signed his release and disappeared. Derek had withdrawn his petition. Frank was bound by a restraining order and would face criminal consequences if he violated it. She was safe. Clara was safe. And in 3 months, the trust would activate, giving her resources to build something meaningful from the ashes of Margaret's revenge. That night, after Clara was asleep, Eve returned to Margaret's study and opened a blank document. The Margaret Whitmore Foundation, complete business plan. She wrote for hours, channeling everything she'd learned from poverty into programs that might actually work: emergency assistance fund, grants up to $5,000 for women facing eviction, covering back rent, security deposits, or first month at a new place. No credit checks, no judgment, just help when it was needed most. Child Care Initiative, subsidized daycare partnerships with established centers, making quality child care accessible to single mothers who couldn't afford $1 and $500 a month for someone else to watch their kids while they worked minimum wage jobs. Legal aid program, free representation for custody battles, domestic violence cases, divorce proceedings. Partnered with firms willing to take pro bono cases, supplemented with foundation funding when necessary. Job training and placement, not generic resume workshops, but actual skills training, medical billing, coding boot camps, paralegal certification connected to employers actively hiring. Financial literacy, taught by people who'd actually been poor, not bankers who'd never missed a meal. Real strategies for managing money when you had almost none. By dawn, she had 40 pages detailing every program, estimated costs, success metrics, governance structure. It would require $10 million to establish, another $20 million to endow for perpetual operation. The foundation would help 1,000 women in its first year, 5,000 by year 3. Become a model other cities could replicate. It wouldn't erase Margaret's pain or bring back William, but it would mean something. It would take all that carefully hoarded wealth and transform it into something living, breathing, necessary. At 7 a.m., Eve called Helena Blackwood. I have the business plan. When can we start? Helena didn't hesitate. The trust activates June 15th. That's 83 days from now. In that time, we'll establish the legal entity, recruit board members, file for nonprofit status, and line up initial partnerships. The moment the $5 million distribution hits your account, we launch. Not we, I launch. This is mine to build. Then I'm here to help you build it right. Helena's voice warmed. Margaret would be proud, Eve. She spent 60 years accumulating this wealth to prove she was strong. You're going to spend the next 60 proving that strength is meant to be shared. The weeks blurred into a rhythm of planning and preparation. Eve worked with Helena on foundation structure, with Marianne on finalizing the permanent restraining order against Frank, with Thomas on tax strategies that would minimize her burden while maximizing the foundation's impact. Clara started noticing changes: nicer food in the refrigerator, new clothes that actually fit a mother who smiled more and cried less. "Mommy, are we rich now?" Eve considered the question carefully, wanting to be honest without creating entitlement. "We have enough, more than enough. But that means we have responsibility to help people who don't have enough. Does that make sense? Like how Pearl helps us." Exactly like that. Pearl and Beck helped us when we needed it. Now we're going to help other people the same way. Can I help too? When you're older, right now your job is to be 7 and do kid things. But someday, if you want, you can work with the foundation and help even more people. Clara seemed satisfied with this answer, returning to her drawing a picture of their house with flowers she was planting in the yard, Pearl and Beck included in the garden, everyone smiling. The permanent restraining order hearing was anticlimactic. Frank didn't appear, sending his lawyer instead to argue that the temporary order was sufficient and a permanent one was excessive. Judge Morales disagreed. Given Mr. DeLuca's pattern of behavior, his criminal record, and his continued efforts to circumvent restrictions through third parties, I'm granting a permanent restraining order. Mr. DeLuca is permanently prohibited from contact with Ms. Harper or her family, from approaching within 100 yards of her residence or her daughter's school, and from any form of surveillance or indirect intimidation. The gavel fell, and that chapter of Eve's life closed with the finality of a book slammed shut. Outside the courthouse, Marianne smiled. That's as good as it gets. If Frank violates a permanent restraining order, he faces criminal charges with real jail time. He'd have to be monumentally stupid to risk it. Or monumentally desperate? Maybe, but you've removed his leverage. Derek withdrew the custody petition. Lawrence signed away his claims. Frank has no more angles to exploit. Marianne packed her briefcase. You're free, Eve. For the first time in this whole nightmare, you're actually free. Free. The word felt foreign, like a language Eve had forgotten how to speak. She drove home, slowly processing the reality that no one was threatening her. No one was demanding money. No one was trying to take Clara. The siege was over. At home, she found Beck in the yard, planting the last of the spring flowers, Pearl supervising from a lawn chair, Clara helping with a tiny trowel. They looked up as Eve approached, and Beck grinned. Heard you won your court thing. Figured that deserved celebration flowers. Pearl stood, brushed dirt off her hands. Also figured you might want company tonight. Not celebrating exactly. More like witnessing. You've come a long way in 3 weeks, child. They had dinner together, simple food, easy conversation, nothing about money or threats or legal battles. Just neighbors who'd become family, sharing a meal in a house that finally felt like home. After everyone left, after Clara was asleep, Eve stood in the garden they'd planted together and looked up at stars barely visible through San Francisco's light pollution. Margaret had stared at these same stars for 40 years alone in this house, protecting secrets no one suspected. She'd won her revenge against the Ashfords, built an empire no one could steal, and died having never really lived. Eve wouldn't make that mistake. She'd take the fortune Margaret built and pour it into the world like light, through open curtains, illuminating paths for others, creating possibilities where before there was only darkness. The most valuable things aren't always the ones that shine. But inheritance, Eve realized, wasn't just what you received, it was what you chose to give forward. She pulled out her phone and called Helena one last time. I want to move the foundation launch up. Not June now. I'll fund the initial establishment with money from the online accounts, then replenish it with the trust distribution when it activates. That's aggressive timeline-wise. We'd need to accelerate the legal filings, the board recruitment. Then let's accelerate. Women are being evicted right now. Mothers are losing custody battles right now. Every day we wait is another day someone goes without help. Eve's voice was steel wrapped in silk. I survived because people like Beck and Pearl and Thomas took chances on me. The foundation exists to take chances on people everyone else has given up on. We start now. Helena was quiet for a moment, then, all right, I'll make the calls tomorrow. The Margaret Whitmore Foundation launches in 30 days. Good. Eve hung up and stood in her grandmother's garden, breathing night air that smelled like jasmine and new beginnings, feeling the weight of $141 million transform from burden into purpose. She'd been given more than money. She'd been given the chance to prove that the most valuable inheritance wasn't wealth itself, it was the courage to use it well. Tomorrow she'd start building the legacy Margaret had been too afraid to create, but wise enough to make possible. Tonight she'd sleep peacefully for the first time in years, knowing Clara was safe, their future was secure, and the fortune hidden in darkness for 6 decades was finally ready to shine.